Peterson this morning from Anteris. Wayne, morning.
Good morning, Andrew.
Look, big news from you, Wayne, this week here. Your first successful valve-in-valve procedure. Just firstly, tell us a bit about what valve-in-valve procedures are, why they're important.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think valve-in-valve is an interesting phenomenon in the valve space for aortic stenosis patients, not just with TAVR, but with surgical valves as well. And essentially what happens is a patient presents with a disease in the first instance, meaning their native valve, the valve you're born with, has deteriorated to the point where you have severe aortic stenosis. That valve has to be replaced. There's no pharmacotherapy, there's no drug you can take for that. So the only way to deal with this disease, as always, is to switch out a part of the anatomy, and that anatomy is the aortic valve. And you can do that surgically, or for patients who are not suitable for surgery, you can do it via the TAVR procedure, which is what we have with DurAVR. Now, when you get to the second valve, you start to get into a little bit of trouble. So patients who have that replacement valve will deteriorate. All of these valves will deteriorate to a point where you may, in fact, need a third valve. So your third valve, your second replacement valve. We're seeing this increasingly with patients, particularly in the last few years as patients are getting younger who are getting the TAVR valves. But certainly there's a bolus of surgical patients as well whose valve deteriorate. And the younger you get this valve, the quicker it actually deteriorates. It actually deteriorate quicker in younger patients. And of course, the bigger issue here is younger patients getting these valves stay alive longer. So you're seeing more of it. The older patients back in the day were in their mid-80s. They get their first replacement valve and probably wouldn't last longer than the valve. And now we're seeing patients who are actually lasting longer than the valve. So the valve is now used to outlive the patient. Now the patient is outliving the valve. They need another replacement. It's a terrible situation. It's salvage therapy. You've got one valve in there that's already failed. You've got to try and stick that second surgical valve into what is a very constricted area. And basically at that point, the outcomes are not fantastic. And the mortality rate in a very short period of time is pretty high. You can expect at best to get very high mean gradients on that second replacement valve, certainly not normal, because you're dealing with a very restricted space. So it's a salvage therapy. It's not a great outcome. When a patient is in that position, they're in trouble. It's, of course, again, fatal if left untreated. And there are very, very few choices for physicians, and none of them are particularly good in terms of the outcomes.
Well, look, Wayne, a big bit of news that broke just before you and I joined this call. Abbott announcing the withdrawal of their surgical valve from the market, called the trifecta, due to valve deterioration, or SVD, as it's known. So tell us a bit more. What's the opportunity? What's the problem here?
Yeah, well, that was an interesting one. And as you quite rightly pointed out, we really just found out about this in the last few hours today. Trifecta is a commonly used surgical valve, has been for some time. And they notified the FDA apparently today that the product needs to be withdrawn due to SVD, structural valve deterioration. So it appears that it has some degree of accelerated deterioration. Again, this speaks to the thesis that these valves all degenerate over time. There is no valve out there that is really, really lasting, the life of the patient as far as we can tell so far. So this has become one of the holy grails. An interesting side note is that our valve-in-valve patient that we announced this week was in fact a surgical patient who did in fact have a trifecta. What does it mean? Well, it's hard to tell right now. We're doing a bit of work this afternoon trying to determine, how many patients had trifectas over the past 5 years, how old they were, and so on. I suspect there's going to be a huge bolus of patients across the board for valve-in-valve, but certainly this group of trifecta patients that probably are going to come online fairly quickly to get some kind of replacement. Very early, we've got to do a lot more work, but it would seem to me that it's pointing in that direction.
Well, your announcement regarding your valve-in-valve procedure indicates the results match your preclinical work. Was that consistency somewhat expected?
Look, it's always a great outcome when you see that, and of course sometimes it doesn't go that way, in medical products in general. I think what we've seen with DurAVR, and I go way back to the sheep models and the pig models and everything else, this product really has, shown complete consistency with the great results we've seen on the bench, preclinical work, animal work, and human work every single time. And that's, I think, just a function of this single piece design that we own. It really speaks to why we're getting consistently the same results. But, when we saw the results on the bench work, that were not, of course, done internally by Anteris, it was done by a physician as an experiment, a structured experiment. And we saw that they were trialing our product inside of the current TAVRs, inside of the current surgical valves, and then trialing the current TAVR valves in the same tests. So it wasn't just looking at ours by itself, and head to head against, the existing TAVR valves out there. The results were incredible because this design, the valve design, is giving us just better mean gradients. What we saw on the bench tests was actually duplicated, but the one thing that we're really excited about was on the bench, we saw that if you got a valve in valve replacement with DurAVR, you actually ended up with better hemodynamic results than when you got your first TAVR valve. So you got your first TAVR valve, you might have had a mean gradient of 15 or 20. Okay, that's expected. DurAVR does better than that on its first day as well. But to get a replacement valve in the normal range is unheard of, because you're going to end up with mean gradients of 20, 25, 35 in that setting. To come out with 6, so you're better off than when you got your first valve that just failed. It's pretty incredible. More patients to come, of course, but it's fairly standard to what we see with the bench tests and preclinical work, translating very accurately across to patients.
Clearly great news for patients. Beyond the medical implications, and we touched on this a bit earlier, but tell us more about the commercial implications.
Yeah, so as always, we look at patients first, and physicians for that matter, and it is fantastic that we really have managed to bring this product forward to a point now, even in these very difficult to treat patients, that we've offered up something that's not me too, that is a completely new device that changes the paradigm and changes outcomes for patients, and of course therefore physicians. Now, what do we know about valve and valve, other than what we just discussed with the trifecta valve being withdrawn? That's obviously somehow got to be factored into all of this now, and I haven't done that yet. But the consistency of valve failure is accelerating quite a lot, and the reason for that is we're seeing these younger patients really only being treated in the last 4 or 5 years. So we're just getting a bolus of that group now, and that's why we're seeing it. Some physicians will tell you 20% or 30%. I've heard as high as 50% of the market. Because it's relatively new, it's hard to get an accurate picture. We'll know 5 years from now what it looks like, and 10 years from now. But my best estimate, talking to the physicians, is somewhere around about 30% of the market will need that replacement in the next 5 years. Now, that's, again, without these trifecta patients. So there's a lot of patients out there. If you take the conventional forecast of the market, which I don't necessarily agree with, but that's the standing forecast, is $10 billion by 2028 US dollars. Then 30% of that is another 3. That's not in the forecast. So you've got to add 3 to that 10. So it's whatever it is, it's a very big number. There's a lot of patients in need. It's a high unmet medical need, and we'll do more patients for this, of course, but this certainly will be the product of choice, I suspect, for treating these particularly difficult to treat patients.
You say you're looking to do more patients. Will that be in the near term?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, getting the approvals that we got through Health Canada, as with any regulator, when you go for a special access kind of program, you really have to prove a lot of things on top of safety and efficacy. You really have to prove that this product is either better than what's available, or there's a chance it'll be better than what's available. And that's the only reason they do it. Otherwise, use something that's on the market. So there was quite a process to get the approval, of course, a lot of documentation. The team internally did a great work. The physicians who advocated with Health Canada did a fantastic job to push their case forward. And of course, we got this patient out, and we submitted for another one and got approval in 2 days. So that patient will come up soon. We've got more coming. I mean, we have to build, a decent number of these patients, 5 to 10, somewhere in that range, to be, fully satisfied that we're seeing this result consistently. But there are going to be a lot more patients on this side, and coming very quickly, simply because there is such a high unmet medical need with this stuff. I mean, people want to know, and the physicians right now, already the ones that we've spoken to have seen this one patient result, are wanting to get their hands on this thing for their own patients who are in trouble.
Well, in terms of indications, what are your plans for registering the product?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this a little bit at the AGM, and I've looked at this the same way for a long time. There essentially are 2 products here. Although we're talking about obviously the same valve, there are different sizes of these valves as well. Now, typically the valve and valve is a smaller valve because you've got so much junk inside there. But, the way to look at this from a regulatory point of view and a commercial point of view is, a very distinct product for valve and valve across the board. And then, of course, the aortic stenosis setting as well. It's important to keep in mind, if you are highly effective in the valve and valve setting, where you've got a really difficult anatomy to deal with, it translates incredibly well to support the case of how good this product is in normal aortic stenosis. We've already shown that with patients, of course, but certainly across the board, this is a product where your patients getting it from day one are going to do well. Your patients who are getting it in valve and valve are going to do well. But clearly, the regulatory pathways could be very different for this. The big regulators around the world have to deal with this problem pretty quickly, I think, and we'll do that safely and based on the data that can be presented. But I think this is going to be such an important product for valve and valve for patients who are in trouble that I think, we're going to have to look at two different regulatory pathways here.
Well, a couple of big opportunities, Wayne, as you point out. What are your upcoming milestones?
Yeah, so I mean, the key one, of course, is our EFS study, the FDA study that's actively recruiting. We're got patients online, we've got scheduling being organized and so on and so forth. I'm on track with the publicly stated timelines of presenting that at TCT in October. So I'm happy with the process. It's keeping us busy right now, that's for sure. I guess the valve and valve stuff has kind of come left field a little bit because we got that one patient did so well that I feel there's going to be a lot more enthusiasm from physicians to get patients moving on that fairly quickly. So that you can look to both those things for sure. I think it doesn't get much bigger than those catalysts. I still, think the back end of this year are probably the biggest 6 months of our history. Just because of the results that are being generated, but certainly keeping the team moving with all the things that are going on.
Good to catch up this morning. Wayne, thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate your time.